These are the questions. If I get these silver coins today, what makes them different than these pre-65s? And are these real silver or not real silver?
Okay, I just lost the video, so I'm hoping you're still with me.
You're
And
good. Go ahead.
yes, there we are. We're back. Okay, so the answer to the question is the pre 64, 64 dated and earlier, they are minted out of silver. And that was the standard for United States coins from the 1790s through 1964. Right after that, in 1964, the production of silver coins came to a complete end. With the exception of a 40% Kennedy half for the next 4 years, all of the silver was removed. So if you happen to have a quarter or a dime, let's say dated 1965, it has zero silver content.
Wow.
Whereas the 1964 and earlier, they were minted with 90% pure silver. And again, that standard was the basis for all money. I heard you at the beginning before we lost our connection. You mentioned the concept of sound money. And, this is the idea was that money was clearly defined not to merely be paper, but to be something tangible, something negotiable, something that actually had intrinsic value. So if you took a weight of silver, let's say roughly a half an ounce, and we labeled that a half a dollar, the fact that we called it a half dollar didn't change its value. It had intrinsic value merely by its weight. And that was supposed to be the way money was supposed to be created, issued, and sustained within the United States. It was supposed to be an obligation of the government to provide a standard by which we could, as the citizenry, count that the currency would remain stable over time. And that was the whole purpose of gold and silver backing paper money in the first place.
Interesting. You're a wealth of knowledge, sir. That's why I we use you, because your education is like top notch. Now, I was actually we'll do a couple questions again later, but I was actually looking through some of your recent podcasts and other shows and stuff because I just like listening. And there was this interesting graphic I saw, which was the Fed has backed themselves into a corner. What is happening right now? Can you give everyone kind of a briefing on what you see occurring in America and honestly the world at this point?
Yeah, it's been really interesting. So, we're on the 50th anniversary this week. August 15th will be the 50th anniversary of when Richard Nixon interrupted public television during a broadcast of Bonanza, believe it or not. And I got that damn theme song stuck in my head now, dun, 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 dun. So, the public's sitting at home, they've had their dinner, they're sitting watching their television sets. And, those days when there was breaking news, it was really something.
Right.
Nowadays, of course, every 5 minutes, I don't care what channel you watch, there's breaking
Breaking.
news. There's some breaking news. And it turns out to be, for the most part, something totally innocuous. But in 1971, on a Sunday evening, Richard Nixon comes before the American public. And I wanted to imagine what the meeting before this interview on television must have looked like with his staff, where he had to sit with his communication director and the vice president and the treasury secretary. And they had to concoct a way of trying to tell the American public, guess what? As of today, August 15th, 1971, that gold that we have been using to back the US dollar is no longer going to be used. And we are now going to enter the age of fiat currency. So
That worked
fiat
out
money
well.
was born. Yeah, it's the anniversary of the birth of fiat money. So happy birthday, right? Now, the funny part is if I sent you that little clip, I don't know if you had a chance to watch it, and it's pretty funny
Yeah.
because the last thing that Richard Nixon says, and it was great to listen to the president of the United States use this word, but he said, the bugaboo that the US dollar will be devalued because we're taking the gold standard, is nonsense and there's nothing to worry about, and that your dollar, as you know it today, will have the same value in the future.
How do you say that
And
with a
that's
straight
pretty,
face?
I don't know. I really don't know. That was an amazing statement to make. Obviously, understanding full well that could not possibly be the case. The only way that would have worked, the only way the dollar from 71, having removed the gold standard, could have possibly remained the same in value is if the government didn't deficit spend. If we had a government that brought in more money than it used, okay, we could have possibly sustained the value of currency, but that clearly was not going to be the case. it was part of the problem that exacerbated the need to take us off the gold and silver standard in the first place. But Nixon used the pretense of currency manipulators. And in the 1960s, when John Kennedy was president, he was fighting a little bit of this with China and foreign countries that were starting to use the fact that the gold standard existed on the dollar to potentially weaken their own currencies from time to time to create a trade problem. So a benefit to them, if they could weaken their currency, their goods and services would become cheaper. So we would buy a Chinese made product as opposed to a US made product because the cost was significantly less, not because of anything except the fact that their currency was weaker. Now, Kennedy decided to instruct John Connally, his Treasury Secretary, to combat this by stockpiling foreign currencies. He was the first president to do that. He said, well, if they're going to try to manipulate their currency, we'll just stockpile a whole bunch of different currencies. And if any one of them gets weaker, we can use it ourselves so that we can help at least eliminate part of the problem. By the time Nixon was president, the fact that we were still on a gold standard, and remember now, this goes back to the convention at Bretton Woods after World War II, where we locked all of the foreign countries into using US dollars and stockpiling US dollars by basically sending a message that said, look, the war effort's going to come to an end. We're going to have peace around the world. And everybody wanted that. And the cost of that is that we are going to establish that the US dollar is going to be king. So from now on, all your foreign currencies notwithstanding, the US dollar is going to reign supreme, and we're going to obligate a lot of you to now only be able to use US dollars to buy certain commodities like gold or oil. And of course, this caused a big response from oil producers. It led to an oil embargo in the mid 70s. Everybody might remember the gas lines we had in the mid 70s. I referred to this because I was a kid at that time, and my dad had a small tire store, a gas station I worked at, and I had to be the kid that went to that last car on the gas line and hang that sign on the back of his license plate that said "Last car for gas." That was it. There were federal limits on how much gas you could pump at a gas station, and it was a crazy response from the public. But this was a knee-jerk reaction from foreign countries. Now imagine if you are a foreign nation, and since the end of World War II, I've promised you that this US dollar that you're holding is backed by gold. And you've gone ahead now and you've stockpiled tons of it, billions and billions of dollars worth. But now I turn around and say, well, Jason, guess what? All those dollars you have stashed away that were backed by gold yesterday, yeah, they're not backed by gold anymore. So the onslaught, the result of that was this backwash of investors around the world dumping US dollars. Everybody who now knew that the dollar wasn't going to be any more backed by gold decided to get rid of them all at the same time. And naturally, the home shore for that was the US. So the strongest demand for dollars was always going to be here domestically. So all the foreign paper money that existed outside the US started pouring back into the shores of the United States. And it created a massive inflationary problem because suddenly there was a large quantity of money chasing the same amount of goods. And that is almost by definition what inflation is. So gold, when they released it after the interview by Richard Nixon in 1971 at $35 an ounce, it in 4 years would hit 100. And then 3 years later, by 1979, crossed $850 an ounce, starting at 35. That's a 17 to 1 increase. So that's the equivalent of taking today's price of gold and saying it's going from $1,800 to $31,000 in a matter of 4 years. That's what we experienced in the late 70s because, a lot of people were smart enough to say, hey, look, if you're not going to back this currency with gold, you can promise all you want that you're going to sustain its value, but we're not buying it.
Yeah. Now, it brings up an interesting point because is there a way to take the dollar off as a reserve currency, put something else in its place that all countries could agree to? I'm just like kind of brainstorming this, where we all use our own currencies, even if we use multiple currencies within even the country, and everything goes through that, but still have countries have great economies. Could you? I mean, is that even possible? Has that ever been done?
Well, the closest thing I could see to that was think about what they did when they established the euro, right? So in the 1990s, they told all of the various European nations, Belgium and France and Italy and Spain and Germany and England, and they said, hey, guess what? We're going to take away your sovereign nation's currency, and we are going to establish a, let's call it European currency status we will all accept. Now, it was a very complicated process because,
Sure.
we had to figure out how many Spanish dollars, how many Italian lira, what was going to be that translation, and how many of these would be equal to this new euro. Would the euro be accepted? Would people be able to get their head wrapped around the idea that, many of these countries had existed for hundreds, thousands of years with their own currency, suddenly now being told, dictated to by large central banks that you can't create your own currency and control it anymore. You're now subject to this broader umbrella. We're putting you all under, and we're going to have the euro. And they did successfully produce the euro. So conceptually, it's been done. And I think theoretically, the hard problem would be I don't think we could get America to go along with the idea of giving up its status as the world's reserve currency. It provides us with a lot of leverage. And, from time to time, it becomes a problem. Trade negotiations are based upon the values of currencies for all intents and purposes. And, when Donald Trump became president, one of the first things he did was attacked the problem of the imbalance in trade agreements. And he said, everybody else had been walking on eggshells because they were afraid to, forgive me, piss off China or piss off Japan because they were afraid of a backwash of what might happen if we didn't play ball. But, Trump took a different position and said, look, we've had such lopsided trade agreements for so many years that there's nothing worse they can do to us than what we have now. So I'll take my chances and just take the whole table and throw it over and start square and start fresh and try to renegotiate. Now, I haven't been worried about things like China for a long time because they sort of went quiet. For a few years, they weren't really active in terms of
They,
what they
they
were
went they went
pursuing.
stealth quiet. It was not a good thing.
Very stealth quiet. Yeah. I don't believe that they were not doing anything. I just believe they were doing anything publicly.
Right.
So we didn't know what was going on. But in the last few months, China is becoming a lot more aggressive again. It's like they've come back out of the closet and they've said, yeah, just in case you forgot about us, we're still here and we still intend to take over the world. And we would still prefer if the US dollar didn't reign supreme. So, they continue to become more aggressive about the way that they are infiltrating the world's economy. And for the first time in years, I'm actually a little bit more worried about what China might do in the future, although I don't think they have enough leverage to take down the dollar as a reserve status. They can start poking the bear and they can start creating problems for us that will force us to deal with things we haven't had to address in a number of years. That's problematic.
Oh, definitely. And it's interesting because what is the Fed printing now? Now, there's two things. I saw there is it 120 billion
A
not
month.
a month, and then also this repo market is out of control. Can you
Yeah.
explain
So
that?
here's the Fed now. Yeah, the Fed's facing a very interesting problem. So, normally speaking, we have a normal economy, the economy slows down. All right. The Fed can adjust interest rates in order to compensate for that. The theory is that if I can make it cheaper for you to borrow money, you'll do that. You'll buy a new car, you'll buy a new refrigerator. If the cost of borrowing money is high, it's going to slow down your spending. So the trick has always been we want to move an economy forward pretty easy, simply lower interest rates. But what happens if you do that and it doesn't work? So you lower them more, and that still doesn't work. And eventually you lower interest rates down to zero, and you still can't get the economy to move forward fast
Which
enough.
is where we are right now.
Then you're hit, right? Now you're hit with a COVID crisis. So not only did you have a slowing economy coming into this, but now on top of that, you're going to exacerbate the problem by a new pandemic that nobody saw coming. So now you've got interest rates already near or at zero for all intents and purposes, and an economy that's still slowing down. So the Fed took other measures. It started to come up with absolutely new methods to try to move an economy forward when the interest rate lever wasn't enough. So it started by doing what it called quantitative easing, which was the buying of debt on the long end of the Treasury's scale. So the Treasury offers debt at levels from a year. They have these notes, they have 5-year notes, they have 10-year bonds and notes, and 30-year bonds. The longer you're willing to hold debt that you buy from today's federal government, the higher the yield they're willing to pay. The government looks at that and says, okay, we'll try to pay as much as we can, but again, they can't pay much more than the current rates that are floating around. And since rates are down to zero from the Fed, even if you buy a 10-year note, that means you're guaranteeing you're holding this for 10 years and you're going to deal with whatever happens in that period of time. They're only offering about 1.5% or so, 1.3, 1.8% on a return. Over a 10-year period, that's not a lot of return when inflation is higher than that rate. So quantitative easing by itself wasn't sufficient. It didn't actually solve the problem. So now the Fed is at zero interest rates. They're buying debt from the government as fast as the Treasury is, the fast as they can, buying the high end paying because they figured that if the only available capital was low end yielding stuff, that effectively that's kind of the same as lowering interest rates. It has about the same effect. But even after purchasing quantitative easing for year after year after year after year and adding to the big balance sheet the Fed was carrying, that didn't work. So now the Fed is looking at other options. What else can it do? So it also begins to encourage the banks to keep heavy reserves on the Fed's balance sheet by paying the banks a little bit higher interest rate on overnight window deposits or deposits at the Fed than the bank would otherwise be able to get. Again, the whole process was to try to keep interest rates low or lower, hoping that they would move the economy forward. So the Fed has been using, tricks that have never been seen before. And unfortunately, while they've been doing this, they have been accumulating these debts from the government at a rate that has never been seen before in U.S. history. So the 120 billion that you mentioned, it's split. $80 billion goes to purchase Treasury obligations, and these are these bonds, the 10 and 30-year notes. The other 40 billion every month is going directly to purchase mortgage-backed securities. So what the Fed is hoping to do is to make it possible for you to get a mortgage cheaper by encouraging banks to sell to the Fed any mortgages that it buys. So normally the way it used to work is if you took out a mortgage, your local bank held that mortgage until you paid it off. So they were worried whether or not you made a payment, and they were on the hook if you didn't. It was their obligation. But instead, what happens now is your local bank writes you a mortgage. They don't have to wait for you to make a payment. They can sell that immediately to the Federal Reserve for all of the money. They get paid in full right off the top, and they're done. So whether or not you ever make a payment no longer matters to the bank.
Why
Now the
why does it
Fed,
sound like that is a absolute disaster in the making and like a market crash has to come? Because it sounds like the absolute apex of irresponsibility.
well, it should, because it should sound just like it did in 2008 when this blew up.
Times about a
And
million.
the additional, yeah, it only cost us $1 billion, right? Or $1 trillion at the time. The problem gets exacerbated because what happens as a result of this is that all of these mortgages that are bought by the Fed, and then the Fed turns to the bank and says, look, we need more of these. We need you to keep writing mortgages. Please find more people to make mortgage loans to because we want to keep buying this debt from you because we need to somehow move this economy forward, and we've got to get people to buy homes. And what's going to happen to the price of homes if everybody can get cheap money, near zero rates? The Fed buys all of the debt from the banks, so the banks don't feel any obligation to not write the mortgage. They're not concerned or being restrictive in who they give the loan to. They'll pretty much give it to anybody. And by doing that, what ends up happening is the prices for real estate start going up higher and higher and higher. But it's not real. It's a completely false market. So are a lot of the prices for things that we're seeing in the open world interest rates and the rates at which stocks are selling are all basically being inflated by the intervention of the Federal Reserve. So the Fed has stepped into the economy. And I think I made the analogy once that the Fed used to be sort of like a rudder on the back of a boat. The engine's driving it forward and it's zipping along, and that rudder adjusts, a little left, a little right. Instead of that, now the Fed has become the engine. It's actually driving the boat. It is the power now. And without it, that boat's not going anywhere. So if our economy is based on the Fed continually acting, what happens when the Fed either can't or won't? Or what happens now when we start to see some recovery and the Fed says, okay, we've been buying all these mortgages, we've been buying all this debt, but we want to start stopping that. We want to taper back our purchases of these assets. Well, let me tell you, the day they announce that they're no longer buying bonds, the bond prices are going to plummet. The yields are going to explode. And that is like interest rates going up, not conducive for the economy. But the Fed believes that at some point it can't continue indefinitely loading its balance sheet, because every time it buys one of these debt instruments, that instrument ends up on the Fed's balance sheet. Eventually, the Fed has to unwind that. And after 2008, the Fed was sitting on $4 trillion in debt that it had accumulated after the crisis of 2008. As of this week, we now have 8.1 trillion on the Fed's balance sheet.
You're in uncharted territory.
Completely uncharted. And my belief is the Fed has no method, no policy, no plan to say, we know how to stop making all these debt purchases, unwind what they estimate to be by next year $9 trillion on its balance sheet, and somehow move the economy forward without creating some sort of economic disaster. I am convinced the Fed has no plan and no way of knowing whether or not any plan they come up with would work, because it's, like you said, it's uncharted territory. They've never been here before. Nobody's ever been here before. And here's the thing. It takes 6 months or more for Fed policy to intervene.
Sure.
If they act today, it doesn't happen tomorrow. It takes months for that to work itself through. So what happens if they make a mistake? We won't know for 5 or 6 months. And then once that mistake becomes clear, what's the Fed going to do then? They're going to probably readjust to compensate for the error, which probably will mean a much more significant change of whatever they're doing, which would also significantly change the economy much greater. So I think instead of a slowing, comfortably depressing the brake on the car and bringing it to a slow halt, this is going to be like slamming the brakes every once in a while. I mean, you're going to jolt the economy. And if they hit it too hard, they're going to throw somebody through the windshield. I mean, I just don't believe that the Fed has a policy in place or a plan in place to address the fact that we've accumulated so much debt and that the Fed has had to do this to drive the economy forward. So that leaves us in a kind of a precarious position where, the only option available to them to print money may resolve the problem. But boy, we better expect the inflation as a result of that to skyrocket.
Yeah. Can we just throw them in jail and restart back to 1776 with sound money? Is that a possibility? Can we just do that?
Yeah, there we go. I like that idea.
But so my only theory out of this, and what I've been following behind the scenes is, and there's a lot of evidence that it can occur, but it's not a for sure thing, is that somehow you pull back the gold reserve currency, maybe silver, multi-metal, tied to digital assets like the crypto. Because Judy Shelton, by the way, have you been watching Judy? Judy's been on a little bit lately, and she's talking about sound money in a cryptocurrency sort of way, and maybe they can absorb money. Like, that's the only way that's the only way I could see how this could ever happen. And I remember we talked about this. You go, I'm not really sure how the mechanism with that would work. And I agree. I don't even know how they do it. But clearly, with what you just said in the last several minutes, either this has to go really bad, or we've got to come up with some ingenious way of getting out of this.
Either that, or what happens is we go through an experience that a lot of people are not used to, which is a high inflationary economy. that would just rip apart the wealth of a lot of people unprepared. Because once that inflation kicks in, it's kind of hard to unwind and nearly impossible. So if the result of this is the printing of larger amounts of money, which I see as probably the only resolution, unfortunately, it's the dollar that takes it on the chin.
Right.
Now, this impacts the public really tremendously, especially those who are trying to save for their future, because what happens is the dollar starts to lose so much of its purchasing power so quickly that you can't own anything that will grow in value fast enough to compensate for that, except for something that's physical and tangible. So, you
Gold and
know,
silver.
gold and silver have been around for thousands of years for this reason. The Constitution defined gold and silver as the form of money for America, because they wanted sound money. They wanted an idea that the public could be convinced that the money system was going to be stable. When they took us off the gold standard, even after Bretton Woods, after World War II, if you were in Europe, you could still redeem your paper U.S. notes for gold. You weren't allowed to in the United States. So we sort of had a gold standard, but it wasn't a true gold standard because the redeemability window was shut down for Americans. Imagine if today you could take all the paper money you've accumulated, walk into a Federal Reserve Bank, and demand silver for the amount of money that you had. I mean, I think a lot of people would take that option because they're convinced that that paper note is unsustainable under current conditions. And I'm kind of concerned that a lot of people can't possibly keep up with everything the Fed is doing. This is complicated stuff. It gets more complicated all the time because the basic simple methods, they don't work anymore. Lowering and raising interest rates, okay, that's something a lot of people can understand. People can understand the borrowing cost of money on a personal level. You can get it if you're paying 21% interest rates on a credit card, or you could borrow money from a bank at 2%. You see your option there. You see what benefits, and you understand that. But when it starts coming down to things like quantitative easing and manipulating overnight window reserves and the Fed keeping balance sheets that are in the trillions of dollars, I mean, look, this is just going to blow past most people. The one thing I think people need to understand is that we had a different monetary system up through 1971. It prevented all of this kind of nonsense. And it simply meant that, look, don't print a dollar unless you've got gold or silver backing it. It's really simple. This way, we retain value over time and money, and a government can't just spend money it doesn't have.
Yep.
So now, without that standard, here we are on the 50th anniversary of the release of the gold standard with the promise from the president, I, Richard Nixon, promise the dollar will not be devalued, right? He called it bugaboo. I think that's funny that the president would use that word. So, national television, the president is calling it bugaboo.
So
But
Brent,
yeah,
so
look at what's
Bretton does Bretton Woods not meet again in about 2 weeks or a week?
Well, they constantly have the convention, but the results of Bretton Woods originally after World War II were very interesting because what we did is we agreed to end all the war efforts, the physical military efforts were going to come to an end. We were going to have peace around the world, but with that came an agreement that everyone would accept the dollar as the world's reserve currency, that no matter where you were in the world, you'd use US dollars specifically to buy oil or gold, and that redeemability of gold would stay against the dollar indefinitely. So if you were a European nation, you shouldn't have any fear of stockpiling dollars. So we're basically dictating to you as a foreign country, hey, you're going to have to take this whether you like it or not. You need to accept the fact our dollar is going to be the currency. You're going to have to use it, or at least compare yours to ours as the basis. But don't worry because it's gold backed and you can redeem it anytime you want.
So they meet again in about 6 days. Do you think anything profound comes out of August 11th to 13th?
Nope.
No? Come on,
I really
Fred.
don't. you know, I don't think that there's any real push behind anything significant at this point. And I think there's enough uncertainty in this economy that I don't see anybody who's come forward and said, I have a plan. Here's my plan. I can wipe out the debt problem. I can solve this fiscal crisis. We can resolve the loss of value in the dollar moving forward. Here's what we need to do A, B, C, D. I don't see that plan. I don't think anybody's got one. So I don't think that anything in
They
terms
are
of
very
current
clueless at the
conversation,
top. I can tell you that. They're not
I
very
think they're
intelligent.
lost.
And they're
Well,
also lining their own pockets.
well, that's true too. So, I mean, we have to also consider the political ramifications and the nature of greed. But even if we take those things off the table, just the sheer mechanism of what we have as an economy right now is very unusual, and it doesn't leave for a lot of options. But I don't think there is a plan that exists that can unwind what we've done. We've made some bad decisions for short-term results without consideration of the long-term effort that is going to be or the long-term detriment that ends up as a result of making those decisions. So, the economy's faltering, and it's like, okay, look, print more money or let it go down the tube. Well, okay, we'll print the money. But wait, doesn't that devalue the currency? Yes, but we'll worry about that later. So, if you've been listening to Chairman Powell lately, a month or two ago, he was in the state of denial, right? There's no inflation.
Big
There's
time.
no inflation. There's no inflation. Well, after a couple of months of inflation numbers skyrocketing, he couldn't do that anymore. He just couldn't keep that up. He just couldn't continue to pretend as if he didn't realize that there was inflation. So then he changed his message, and it became, okay, we're surprised by the sudden increase in inflation.
Yeah,
They're
sure.
surprised. They didn't see it coming. Don't know how it happened. We're just moving along here. Everything's fine. And suddenly, oh, look, there's inflation. Where did that come from? So then they changed to, okay, we're surprised by the rate of inflation. Well, that didn't hold up very well. So then it became, oh, it's just transitory. Well, yes, okay, so we were wrong. Yes, well, we thought there was no inflation. Okay, there is inflation. And okay, it's bigger than we thought it was, and it's increasing faster than we thought. But wait a minute, it's okay because this is all temporary. It's all going to fade away. And then a couple of months later, it became, well, some of it may last a little longer than we expected, but don't worry because we can always raise interest rates if we have to somewhere down the line.
Right. Well,
Meanwhile, before they can raise rates, they first have to deal with this purchasing of assets. This 120 billion a month that they're spending has to end. You have to do that first. So if they're going to come out and say, we're not buying bonds anymore, the last time they tried to do that in 2013 and 2014, they called it a taper tantrum. Imagine, if you've had a baby or if you know a baby, when they throw a temper tantrum, it's just loud and obnoxious, and it's just almost nothing you can do.
right.
They're out of control. They're not going to be happy with anything. And this is what happened in 14 when the Fed announced, they didn't even do anything. They just announced they were going to slow down their asset purchases. The market went crazy. The stock market dropped. The bond market yields started increasing. Bond prices started dropping. And everybody within a month was freaking out about the economic environment. The Fed had to backpedal and say, okay, maybe we won't. We won't take the punch bowl from the party. We'll keep buying assets and we'll keep continuing moving forward. I think now the problem is going to be far worse because then we only had 4 trillion on the balance sheet of the Fed. Now we have 8 trillion. The problem has doubled, and that's a bigger problem to
Right.
address. So I wonder what's going to happen. But watch the bond yields, what it pays to get a bond and
Right.
how much it costs, and watch those yields because they go inverse with the rates of interest. So the higher interest rates, the lower bond yield, verse versa. So if the Fed comes out and says, we're not going to buy $80 billion anymore in bonds, the next day, I guarantee you the bond yields will drop. And, once that happens, that's going to be very difficult for the stock market because, again, the stock market has also been pushed by the Fed pumping money into the economy at a crazy pace.
Right.
They made money available to corporations at near zero. They hoped that the corporations would take that capital and build infrastructure and a new manufacturing plant and hire more people. No, they didn't do that. They took the money the Fed gave them and they bought their own stock. So they just went to the open market and bought their own stock. So by buying so much
Nothing
stock,
wrong with that.
well, no, it drove the stock price up. The shareholders were thrilled. But the problem is, what's creating that higher price for the stock? Is it real,
No,
or is it an
it's all
artificial market?
synthetic.
Right. So I think the real estate market, by virtue of the fact that the Fed's buying all these mortgages, the stock market, by virtue of the fact the Fed has made cheap money available to corporations, and the value of the dollar are all very tenuous right now. And I don't think either of those, any of those three, will retain current levels going forward. It just seems inevitable they're going to have to give. And if people are diversified, they'll be okay. But if they're too heavily weighted in these paper investments, once these corrections kick in, they may not have the time to let that recover. I mean, we've had stock market crashes before, but they take a decade or more to recover.
Right.
Some people don't have that time constraint.
Plan or no plan, gold and silver is the only route to go.
Well, it's the sound money. It's, it's what's left when all the smoke clears.
Right.
It's the real physical wealth. It's something tangible and real and true. And, it's a form that will sustain itself over time and through these volatile times, because you can't manipulate it. You can't change. I mean, look, you can manipulate the price of silver. Don't get me wrong. You can manipulate the price of gold. It's a lot more difficult because it is a worldwide market and it is owned by so many people. And with gold to silver coins, the reason I favor them is because not only are we dealing with that actual metal, the real physical metal, and again, what we're talking about is people taking delivery and having it in their possession. So they're not buying a future contract option, some paper derivative that says something is yours, but you own that. You own it physically. And there's a limited amount of this stuff that exists. They can't go back unless, if you know anybody, I don't know anybody who's got a time machine. We can go back in time in 1964 and we can mint more silver quarters. Okay. But if that's not the case, which obviously not, then we only have whatever was minted at that point in history moving forward forever,
Right.
against the amount of paper money, which is constantly being expanded because the government is spending trillions of dollars it doesn't have. And the only way it can make up the gap is to print more. It can't raise that money by taxing you and me and everybody else to raise that additional revenue. It would have to raise taxes, to the point where 100% of the money you earn would be taxed. You wouldn't have
Right.
anything left. Even the levels we're at now are difficult for people to deal with. Imagine if your tax rate doubled or tripled because the Fed or the government had to bring in more capital. That's not going to work.
Right.
So unless the government can somehow get control over its deficit spending, which of course seems ridiculous when they're talking about a $1.2 trillion new infrastructure bill, and they're putting stimulus packages out there. They're sending checks out to people. Again, there may be some very smart reasons why they're doing that, but these things come at a cost. And if you're planning for your next 5 years out or 10 years out, you got to make sure that you include these costs in your plan. Don't ignore it. Otherwise, you're going to be blindsided by, a dollar 5 years from now buys a third or half in 5 or 10 years of what it buys now. For a lot of people, that is a really difficult mountain to overcome.
No, totally. And before we head out today, so this is a question I got, and we'll close on this. Is we talk about, I say pre-65, but 64 or earlier.
Yeah, pre-65 is fine.
Are you running out of supply? Is there a, when it comes to that?
Let me tell you something. There have been 2 or 3 points this year where it was almost impossible to get a full bag of silver coins. I mean, it was getting difficult. And it's interesting because what happened almost immediately is the premium above the metal they're made grew, and it expanded because the demand was outstripping the supply. And every dealer in the nation that deals in this was in the same position. Most dealers I've talked to in the past year or so, they can't hold inventory anymore. They can't seem to keep it in stock. They get stuff in, it's gone in a couple of days. They get more in, it's gone in a couple of days. And everybody is running a lot more tight than I've ever seen. And I've been doing this for 37 years now. There used to always be a huge overhang of inventory that a couple of dealers always had a large supply, and 100 dealers could come to this one guy and get enough to fill all the orders they need. Nobody has an overhanging supply anymore. Nobody. Everybody is running pretty much as tight as I've ever seen it. So, that's a big change. So it sort of moves from that. There's a lot of product available on the shelves, and it's always there, and there's plenty of it. And you come in and you might dent it, a little bit, but there's still plenty left, to a handful of people have a stockpile of stuff on their shelves, to nobody has a stockpile on their
Right.
shelves. And that's where we are right now. Nobody has a stockpile anymore. So the next click up, if you will, a little additional demand push, and supplies get wiped out. And we've seen this twice this year already. And it was interesting how fast the supply was just completely dissipated. I mean, it became a real challenge. So as of today, there's a flow, but it is tight. And at any given moment, things are getting a little bit trickier. Half dollars are starting to separate themselves a little bit more from quarters and dimes, and that never used to be the case. Silver dollars used to trade the same as quarters and dimes and halves. That's no longer the case. So little by little, things are beginning to show up the way you would expect based upon how many of these things were produced. So I'm a big fan of people taking possession because at least you've got it. And if the supplies become impossible to get in the future, what will happen is not only will you see an increase because the metal will probably go up as well, you'll also get those premium value growth prospects that will kick in. So you get those two things that help drive up the value. It's very interesting to watch that dynamic as, a lot more people, young people, older people are beginning to put this together, and they're just becoming a bit uncomfortable with the idea that, how long can a government sustain itself? And it leads to people speculating. I mean, I think that's part of the reason cryptos carry a lot of weight and there's so much interest in them. I mean, look, if the dollar were stable, and everything was great, there wouldn't be as much interest in looking for an alternative.
It's
Why would
true.
people care? I mean, they might still have an interest just because the technology is new and different, and speculating on maybe this becomes a future method of conducting commerce, but
They're
there
hedging
wouldn't be
against
anywhere
it.
near.
They're using it to hedge against it.
Yeah, and why? Because they're losing confidence, and
Right.
herein lies the final
And that's
problem.
all money is confidence.
That's it. That was the last thing I was going to say, is that where we are now, since we're so far removed from real tangible money, we're so far removed from that gold or silver standard against the dollar, what we're left with is confidence. How do you feel about the dollar? Do you feel confident enough? How willing are you to stockpile your future in dollars? And let me tell you something, if that confidence cracks, people will run for the exits like the building is on fire.
That is
There
correct.
won't be any looking back. There won't be any slow, diminished exit. It will be rapid, massive, and it will overwhelm us if people begin to lose confidence in the dollar. So the Fed is, again, I can't even imagine what these conversations must be like before the Fed goes public and they have to come on a broadcast and say, somehow we have to justify what we're doing. And when we're done, we have to leave people feeling like, okay, after what they've done and what they've said, and we know we're 31 trillion in debt and we're adding a trillion a year to, spending a trillion a month and all the stuff that's going on, we're going to be confident in the future value of the dollar. I wonder when that confidence will erode. And if it does, where we stand then is going to be different than where we are now.
I agree. Go check out Fred at uscoincapital.com. Capital is CAPITOL, like the US Capitol. And what's the number, Fred, for everyone to reach you?
800-878-COIN. 800-878-2646.
Ooh, I like that. US Coin Capital. This is where I get all of my stuff. That's the only place I go because I can trust it. Fred, I'll have you back in a couple weeks after Bretton Woods. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, who knows? Maybe they come out and announce that they've come up with a plan. I'd love to see it. I mean, again, like I said, and I don't say this lightly, after 37 years of researching the Fed and its history, money and how it works, I do not see a plan. I don't see an economic environment that allows for them to quickly, quietly, safely unwind the nonsense, especially when you couple this with a government that has absolutely no self-control. They just can't keep spending money they don't have.
That's the perfect way to end it. Anyone who knows anything at this point is in just total disgust, and that's exactly all you need to know.
I encourage people to look up the clip of Richard Nixon in 1971, making the announcement, breaking into Bonanza, and listen to the very last thing he says, where he said, if if you're concerned at all that this is going to devalue the dollar, it's just a bunch of bugaboo.
Absolutely. What was that phone number one more time?
1-800-878-2646. I do have a couple of interesting little packages put together too. I specifically designed some for your listeners.
Awesome.
And some of them have taken advantage of these. But anyway, feel free to give us a call. We've got silver, we've got gold, we've got mixed packages. We've got some interesting stuff available. And, I hate to sound like that, but while supplies last. But hey, while supplies last.
It's true. And I'll get with you afterwards, and we'll we'll get away so I can promote all that stuff for you as well, because I want to get people taken care of. All right, sir. I appreciate you. Fred Dashevsky, U.S. Coin Capital,
Sorry
sir.
about the technical problems this morning.
No worries. No worries. This is Dr. Jason Dean, Brave TV. You guys have a great day and be money safe. Talk to you soon. Take care.